When a man starts losing interest, most women make the same mistake. They chase harder. They text more. They overthink every silence, hoping somehow they can bring back what is already slipping away. But what no one tells you is this: the more you chase, the faster you lose your power in his eyes. Because attraction doesn't grow in pressure, it fades in it. And the real shift happens the moment you stop reacting to his distance and start reclaiming your own energy. That's where everything changes, not with begging, not with explaining, but with silence that speaks louder than words ever could. When you stop chasing him, you force him to feel the space your presence used to fill. And that space is never just empty silence. It is emotional contrast. It is realization. It is discomfort. And it is clarity all happening at the same time. Because when you were chasing, you were constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly softening the impact of his distance with your effort. He never had to sit in the reality of losing you because you were always there to remind him you still cared. But the moment you step back, not out of games, not out of manipulation, but out of self-respect, something powerful shifts in the dynamic. He starts to experience the weight of your absence in ways he never noticed your presence. It is not that he suddenly discovers love. It is that he suddenly feels the lack of it in his daily routine, in his emotional comfort, in the attention he quietly took for granted. And this is where the truth begins to surface, because silence has a way of revealing what constant attention was hiding. When you are always chasing, you become predictable energy in his life. He knows you will text again. He knows you will check in again. He knows you will not fully walk away even when you are hurt. And that certainty, even if he once cared, slowly reduces urgency. Not because you are not valuable, but because availability without boundaries teaches the wrong emotional lesson. But when you stop chasing, you interrupt that pattern completely. You remove yourself from the cycle he was comfortable in, and now he is left with something unfamiliar: your absence. And absence is not neutral, it creates questions. Did she stop caring? Did I push her too far? Why do I feel like something is missing today? These thoughts don't appear because you begged less. They appear because you finally chose yourself more. And in that shift, you are no longer reacting to his behavior. You are redefining how your presence should be treated. This is the moment where emotional power begins to return to you. Not because you are trying to control him, but because you are no longer abandoning yourself for someone who is uncertain about you. The truth is, when a man senses that he can lose access to your energy, your attention, and your emotional softness, he is forced to reassess your value in a way that words could never achieve. It is not your explanations that make him think. It is your withdrawal from the emotional pattern he was benefiting from. And in that silence, he starts to feel what he ignored before: the consistency you gave, the effort you made, the way you showed up, even when he didn't fully meet you halfway. But now, without you constantly reinforcing your presence, he is left alone with the memory of it. And here's where most women misunderstand the process. They think stepping back means playing a game, waiting for him to panic, or hoping he will immediately come running. But the deeper transformation is not about his reaction. It is about your return to self-value. Because when you stop chasing, you are no longer negotiating your worth through his attention. You are quietly stating that your energy is not something you have to earn back through confusion or inconsistency. And that shift alone changes how he perceives you, even if he doesn't show it immediately. Silence gives him no distraction, no easy reassurance, and no emotional escape. He has to sit with the reality of what your presence meant, and more importantly, what your absence now feels like. That is why this one decision, stopping the chase, carries so much emotional weight. It is not just about creating distance. It is about restoring balance that was quietly lost while you were overgiving. And in that restored balance, you are no longer the one trying to be chosen. You become the one who is no longer overextending for uncertainty. That is the moment everything begins to shift, not through effort, but through absence that finally speaks louder than presence ever could. Real attraction doesn't die from distance. It dies when you stop valuing yourself, and that is the part most people don't see clearly in the moment. They assume that if someone is pulling away, the solution is to move closer, to try harder, to become more available, more understanding, more patient, more forgiving. But attraction is not built on how much you can endure. It is built on how much you respect your own emotional boundaries while still loving someone. The irony is that distance alone is not what weakens connection. In many cases, distance actually creates curiosity, reflection, and emotional awareness. But what destroys attraction is the internal shift that happens when you begin to abandon your own value just to keep someone near you who is already halfway gone. When you start overextending yourself for someone who is losing interest, something subtle but powerful changes inside you. You begin to negotiate your worth. You start asking yourself questions like, if I explain better, will he stay? Or if I try harder, will he see me differently? Or if I become more patient, will he realize my value? And without noticing, you slowly start to place your emotional stability in their hands. That is where attraction begins to fade. Not in them, but in the way you start to see yourself. Because when you stop valuing your own peace, your own dignity, and your own emotional balance, you start to operate from a place of fear instead of strength. And fear, no matter how deeply it is hidden behind love, changes the energy you bring into a connection. A man may not always understand this consciously, but he feels it. He feels when the dynamic shifts from mutual connection to emotional dependency. He feels when the energy becomes heavier, when the conversations feel more like pressure than peace, when the presence that once felt grounded begins to feel uncertain. And in that shift, attraction naturally starts to weaken, not because you became less worthy, but because the energy of self-abandonment replaces the energy of self-respect. The version of you that once stood firm in her own value is now trying to earn something that should have been mutual from the beginning. But here is the truth that changes everything. Real attraction is deeply connected to how much you honor yourself when things are not going your way. When you choose yourself, even in moments of emotional discomfort, when you resist the urge to chase someone who is already distancing themselves, when you refuse to shrink your standards just to keep access to someone's attention, that is when your energy becomes different. It becomes grounded. It becomes calm. And calm confidence is far more powerful than anxious effort. Because anxious effort says, I hope you don't leave me. While calm confidence says, I am still here, but I will not lose myself trying to hold on to what is not holding me back. And this is where attraction either collapses or transforms. If you continue to abandon yourself, the connection becomes imbalanced. You become the one investing emotionally while the other person becomes the one deciding how much access you get. But when you stop that pattern, when you pause the overgiving, when you return your focus to your own emotional well-being, something unexpected happens. You start to regain not just their attention, but your own identity inside the situation. You are no longer reacting. You are observing. You are no longer chasing. You are choosing whether this aligns with your self-worth. And that shift changes everything internally, even before anything changes externally. Because attraction at its core is not just about two people. It is about energy balance. And the moment you stop devaluing yourself to maintain someone else's presence, you restore that balance. You become someone who is no longer emotionally easy to access without intention, without consistency, without respect. And that naturally changes how you are perceived because people unconsciously adjust their behavior around the standards you demonstrate, not the standards you explain. So when you stop valuing yourself, attraction fades because you are no longer showing the version of you that is rooted in confidence and emotional stability. But when you return to that version, when you stop chasing, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop lowering your emotional standards for temporary reassurance, you don't just regain attraction, you regain control over your own emotional world. And that is the real turning point because love without self-value always becomes confusion, but love with self-value becomes clarity, even if the outcome is uncertain. The moment you choose yourself, you reset the emotional balance he thought he controlled. And this is not a loud or dramatic moment. It is quiet, almost invisible at first. But internally, it changes everything. Because until that moment, the dynamic was built on repetition. You reaching out, you explaining, you adjusting, you softening the tension, you trying to keep things emotionally connected, even when he was slowly stepping back. And without realizing it, that pattern created a kind of emotional structure where he could move freely while still knowing you would remain available. But when you choose yourself, even in a subtle way, that structure collapses, not because of anger, not because of punishment, but because you are no longer participating in the imbalance. Choosing yourself does not always mean walking away physically. Sometimes it begins in the smallest internal shift. You stop overthinking his silence. You stop rushing to fill emotional gaps he leaves behind. You stop prioritizing his responses over your own peace. And in that moment, something powerful changes in how the entire connection operates. Because what he once assumed was stable access to your attention becomes uncertain. What he once expected as consistent emotional availability becomes something he has to actually earn through effort and presence. And that uncertainty is what resets the balance because now he is no longer dealing with a version of you that is constantly adjusting to him. You are becoming someone who is anchored in herself again. This is where many people misunderstand what actually creates emotional impact. It is not begging. It is not chasing. It is not emotional over-explaining. Those things may temporarily keep someone close, but they rarely create respect. What creates respect is when your behavior reflects self-value, even in emotionally vulnerable situations. When you choose yourself, you are no longer bending your emotional reality around someone else's inconsistency. You are no longer allowing confusion to dictate your actions. And that internal stability is deeply felt on the other side, even if it is not immediately acknowledged. Because in relationships where one person has been overgiving and the other has been pulling back, there is always an unspoken assumption that the giver will continue giving no matter what. That assumption creates imbalance. It creates emotional comfort for one side and emotional instability for the other. But when you choose yourself, you disrupt that assumption. You stop confirming the expectation that you will always be available regardless of how you are treated. And in that disruption, the emotional balance shifts. Suddenly, he is no longer interacting with someone who is endlessly accessible. He is interacting with someone who has standards again, even if they are not verbally stated. And this is where the psychological shift becomes very real. Because when someone realizes they no longer have unlimited emotional access to you, they begin to reassess your presence. Not necessarily because they suddenly fall in love, but because the dynamic has changed. What was once predictable becomes uncertain. What was once taken lightly now carries weight. And in many cases, that weight triggers reflection. He begins to notice the absence of your usual responses. He begins to notice the space where your attention used to be. And most importantly, he begins to feel the difference between having you emotionally available and having to consider what it means if you are not. But the deeper transformation is not in him. It is in you. Because choosing yourself means you are no longer operating from emotional dependency. You are no longer measuring your worth by how quickly he responds, how often he reaches out, or how much attention he gives you. Instead, you are returning to your own emotional center. You are remembering that your peace is not supposed to be negotiated. Your time is not supposed to be something you constantly wait to be acknowledged. Your energy is not supposed to be something you pour endlessly into uncertainty. And as you return to that state, something shifts in how you carry yourself. You become less reactive. You become less emotionally entangled in every small change of his behavior. You stop interpreting distance as rejection and start seeing it as information. And that emotional clarity is powerful because it prevents you from falling back into patterns of overchasing. Instead of trying to fix the connection at all costs, you begin to observe whether the connection is even meeting you halfway. That observation alone changes everything because emotional balance is not restored through effort alone. It is restored through self-respect. When you choose yourself, you are not trying to control him. You are controlling your own participation in imbalance. And that is why the reset is so powerful. It forces the dynamic to either adjust or reveal its truth. If there is real interest, effort begins to match effort. If there is not, distance becomes clearer without confusion. Either way, you are no longer trapped in uncertainty because you are no longer abandoning yourself to maintain it. So the moment you choose yourself is the moment the entire emotional equation changes. Not because you forced it, not because you manipulated it, but because you stopped participating in a version of connection where your value was being silently overlooked. And in that pause, in that shift, in that return to self, the balance that once favored confusion starts to move back toward clarity, and more importantly, back toward you. Silence isn't weakness. It's the loudest reminder of what he's about to lose. And this is something most people completely misunderstand because they associate silence with giving up, with being powerless, or with emotional defeat. But real silence, the kind that comes from self-respect and emotional control, is none of those things. It is not you disappearing in pain. It is you withdrawing from a space where your presence was not being fully valued. And in that withdrawal, something powerful happens that words could never achieve. Because silence does not argue. Silence does not beg. Silence does not chase. It simply reveals. It reveals what words were hiding, what effort was masking, and what constant availability was preventing him from fully recognizing. When you are constantly present in someone's emotional space, they rarely feel the absence of you. Even if they care, even if they are attached in some way, the human mind adjusts to consistency. It normalizes it. It begins to assume that your energy, your attention, and your emotional presence will always be there. And when something becomes predictable, it often becomes undervalued, not because it has less worth, but because it is always available. But silence breaks that illusion. Silence interrupts the comfort of assumption. Silence creates contrast. And in that contrast, reality begins to surface because now, instead of reacting to your messages, he is sitting with the absence of them. Instead of hearing your voice, he is noticing the lack of it. Instead of receiving your attention, he is experiencing what it feels like when that attention is no longer automatically given. And that shift creates internal awareness, not always immediately, not always dramatically, but gradually. The mind starts to register the difference between having access to you and losing easy access to you. And that difference is where emotional reflection begins. But here is the deeper truth. Silence is not just about what he feels. It is about what you are no longer participating in. Because silence is also your boundary. It is your decision to stop overextending into spaces where you were not being met with equal energy. It is the moment you stop explaining yourself to someone who was not fully listening. It is the point where your emotional energy stops flowing in one direction. And that change alone shifts the entire dynamic because relationships are not only shaped by words, they are shaped by access, effort, and emotional availability. When you remove your constant presence, you are no longer reinforcing a dynamic where he can remain emotionally comfortable without reciprocating at the same level. And that discomfort he begins to feel is not caused by pressure. It is caused by absence because absence forces reflection in a way presence never can. Presence allows avoidance. Absence demands awareness. And in that awareness, he is forced to confront the reality of what your energy actually meant in his life. Silence also has a psychological effect that is often underestimated. It creates space for interpretation. When someone is constantly engaging, there is no room for imagination. Everything is defined through interaction. But when you step back, the mind begins to fill in the gaps. He starts to wonder what changed. He starts to question whether you are upset, whether you are moving on, whether you are emotionally detaching, or whether he misjudged your level of attachment. And those questions do something very important. They shift attention inward. Instead of him simply receiving your energy, he starts analyzing the loss of it. But silence is not about controlling his thoughts. It is about protecting your emotional integrity. Because the version of you that was constantly available was also the version of you that was constantly emotionally exposed. Every unanswered message, every delayed response, every inconsistency affected you more deeply because you were still fully engaged in trying to maintain something that was not being equally maintained from the other side. Silence interrupts that cycle. It pulls you out of emotional overinvestment and places you back into observation. And that shift is where clarity begins. And clarity is something that emotional chaos often prevents. When you are constantly chasing, you are not thinking clearly. You are reacting. You are interpreting every small signal as hope or disappointment. You are reading between lines that may not even exist. But when you enter silence, you are no longer feeding that emotional loop. You are no longer amplifying uncertainty with action. Instead, you are allowing reality to show itself without interference. And that is where truth becomes visible. Because if there is genuine interest, silence will not erase it. It will expose it. If there is emotional investment, silence will not destroy it. It will reveal its strength or weakness. And if there is none, silence will also make that clear without you having to force answers or chase closure. In every direction, silence brings truth to the surface. And truth, even when uncomfortable, is always more valuable than confusion disguised as connection. But perhaps the most powerful part of silence is what it does to you internally. Because when you stop chasing, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop trying to secure emotional certainty from someone inconsistent, you begin to rebuild your own emotional foundation. You start to feel your own presence again without filtering it through someone else's response. You start to regain emotional control that was slowly being lost in constant anticipation. And that return to self is where real strength is rebuilt. Silence teaches you that you do not need to keep proving your value to someone who is unsure of it. It teaches you that your energy becomes more powerful when it's not constantly spent trying to convince the wrong person to see you differently. And most importantly, it teaches you that walking away from emotional imbalance is not loss. It is restoration. So when you choose silence, you are not becoming invisible. You are becoming undeniable in a different way. Because now your presence is no longer diluted by overaccess. Your value is no longer explained through effort. And your energy is no longer given away without direction. Instead, it becomes contained, grounded, and self-directed. And in that state, silence stops being emptiness. It becomes impact. It becomes clarity. And it becomes the strongest reminder of what he no longer has unlimited access to and what you are no longer willing to give without being valued in return. And here's the truth most people never learn. You don't fix fading interest by running after it. You shift it by returning to yourself. The energy you stop giving him is the energy that brings clarity, respect, and sometimes regret. Let this be the moment you stop chasing and start choosing you again.